Part 1, The Spark in the Shadows, 1933 to 1939. The world didn't collapse in a single day. It trembled first, quietly, almost politely, as if the earth itself hesitated to remember what it had done 20 years before. Europe in the 1930s still bore the scars of the Great War. Towns rebuilt themselves upon bones, fields sprouted over forgotten trenches. In cafes from Paris to Berlin, people swore there would never be another one. But peace, in those years, was a fragile thing, built on denial, debt, and fear. Germany, 1933. A man with fierce eyes and a voice like thunder rose from the ruins. Adolf Hitler, once a failed artist, now stood before cheering crowds who saw in him a promise, or perhaps a mirror of their anger. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated, its economy broken, its people starving. Hitler offered revenge, revival, unity. On January 30, 1933, he became Chancellor. Within months, democracy was gone. The Reichstag burned, opposition parties were banned, dissenters vanished. The world watched, some in horror, others in relief. To many outside Germany, he seemed a barrier against communism, not yet the architect of disaster. In that same year, the first concentration camps were built. Dachau opened its gates, not yet to exterminate, but to silence. Europe drifts toward danger. In Italy, Mussolini already ruled with iron and spectacle. In Spain, civil war broke out, fascists against republicans, and the world tested its future weapons on Spanish soil. Germany sent the Condor Legion, bombing Guernica into ash in 1937, a rehearsal for horrors yet to come. The democracies, Britain, France, watched uneasily. They remembered 1914, the graves, the endless mud. Their leaders spoke of appeasement, believing they could satisfy the appetite of tyranny by feeding its small nations. Meanwhile, in the east, another storm gathered. In Asia, Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, then China in 1937, carving an empire through blood and fire. The League of Nations condemned, then did nothing. The world, exhausted from the last war, hoped this one might simply pass. The Rhineland, 1936. Hitler tested the West. Under the treaty, German troops were forbidden to enter the Rhineland, the industrial heart near France's border. But on March 7, 1936, he sent them in, just 22,000 men. Had France resisted, the Wehrmacht had orders to retreat. France did nothing. Hitler later said it was the greatest risk of my life. It succeeded, and the world learned that Germany's word no longer mattered. The Anschluss, 1938. Austria fell without a shot. German troops rolled into Vienna to the cheers of crowds waving swastikas. The borders blurred, the empire of language and race began. Europe protested, weakly, but Hitler knew, fear was his ally, and hesitation his weapon. The Sudetenland crisis. Next came Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. Czechoslovakia looked to France and Britain for help, but both nations, desperate to avoid war, instead chose negotiation. At the Munich conference, Hitler sat across from Neville Chamberlain and Édouard Daladier. No Czech representative was invited. They handed him the Sudetenland, believing they had saved peace. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Within 6 months, Hitler had seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Peace had not been saved. It had been sold. Poland stands alone. In August 1939, the world held its breath again. Hitler demanded Danzig, the Polish corridor to the Baltic. But this time, Britain and France swore to defend Poland. They believed this would deter him. Instead, it provoked him. On August 23, a shocking alliance was announced. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with secret clauses dividing Eastern Europe between them. Communists and fascists, sworn enemies, now partners in plunder. A week later, the invasion began. September 1, 1939. Dawn broke over Poland under the roar of Stuka dive bombers. Germany's blitzkrieg, lightning war, struck with tanks, planes, and precision. The Polish cavalry, brave but hopelessly outmatched, rode into steel and fire. Britain and France declared war on September 3, keeping their word, but they did not act. They called it the phony war, a strange quiet on the Western Front while Poland burned. By the end of the month, Soviet troops invaded from the east. Within weeks, Poland ceased to exist, carved between Hitler and Stalin. Europe had entered war once more. And this time, there would be no illusions of glory. The world darkens. By winter, the Nazi flag flew from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Refugees flooded westward, bringing tales of executions, deportations, and mass arrests. In Germany, propaganda swelled, victory parades, triumphant speeches, and beneath it all, silence about what followed the soldiers. The camps expanded. The ghettos began. In the shadows of victory, the machinery of annihilation stirred, still hidden, still unspoken, but already designed. Epilogue, the threshold of war. As 1939 ended, Europe's lights dimmed once again. London sandbagged its windows. Paris drilled for air raids. Berlin celebrated. The Second World War had begun not with a declaration, but with the quiet death of disbelief. And though no one yet knew it, the next 6 years would reshape the world, and redefine what it meant to be human. The guns were not yet silent, yet already the earth remembered the sound. End of Part 1, The Spark in the Shadows. Part 2, Blitzkrieg and the Fall of Empires, 1940 to 1941. Europe awoke in 1940 to the sound of engines. The silence of the phony war ended overnight. What had begun as a border conflict over Poland was about to consume the continent. Germany's armies stood ready on every frontier, sleek, disciplined, and confident. Their commanders had perfected a new art of war, blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was speed, coordination, and terror made mechanical, the tank, the dive bomber, and the radio working together like one organism. The old generals of Europe still thought in trenches. Hitler thought in movement. The fall of Denmark and Norway. On April 9, 1940, without warning, German troops crossed into Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day, its army ordered to surrender before Copenhagen could be destroyed. Norway resisted longer, but not long enough. The world saw, for the first time, how fast an empire could collapse under air and armor. For Britain and France, it was a jolt, the war was no longer distant. Churchill, watching from London, wrote later, the enemy had not only invaded a land, but an age. The invasion of France, May 1940. At dawn on May 10, the Wehrmacht struck west. The Allies expected an attack through Belgium, as in the Great War. They were right, and also wrong. While their main forces raced north to meet the German advance, Hitler's real blow came through the Ardennes forest, a place the French believed impassable for tanks. Within days, panzer divisions rolled through the forest, crossed the Meuse at Sedan, and poured into France's heart. The Maginot Line, France's proud fortress, was bypassed, made irrelevant by mobility. By May 20th, German troops reached the English Channel. The French army, once the pride of Europe, was split in two. In the port city of Dunkirk, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers found themselves trapped against the sea. Dunkirk, the miracle of escape. Between May 26 and June 4, under constant bombardment, a desperate evacuation began. Warships, fishing boats, ferries, and private yachts, every vessel Britain could muster, crossed the Channel again and again. They rescued 338,000 men. It was not a victory, but it was not defeat either. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. Yet he also warned. Wars are not won by evacuations. Behind them, France collapsed. The fall of France. On June 10, Italy declared war on a dying nation, hoping to share in the spoils. 4 days later, German troops entered Paris. The city of light fell silent. The government fled south. Marshal Philippe Pétain sought an armistice. On June 22, 1940, in a cruel echo of 1918, the French signed their surrender in the same railway carriage at Compiègne where Germany had once been humiliated. Hitler stood watching, savoring the symmetry. France was divided, the north occupied, the south ruled by the collaborationist Vichy regime. Europe now lay under the swastika from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Britain stands alone. Only Britain remained. Hitler expected its surrender, instead, he found defiance. On June 4, Winston Churchill had spoken to Parliament. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." The next battle would be fought in the skies. The Battle of Britain. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe began its assault, first targeting airfields and radar stations, then cities. The aim, destroy the Royal Air Force, prepare the way for invasion. The RAF fought back with courage and mathematics. Outnumbered 3-1, British pilots used radar, a new, secret weapon, to anticipate every attack. Their aircraft, the Spitfire and Hurricane, became symbols of endurance. On September 15, 1940, Hitler postponed the invasion. Britain had survived the Blitz. For the first time, Germany had failed. The Blitz. But the bombing did not stop. From September 1940 to May 1941, London and other cities were pounded nightly. Families slept in underground stations, children evacuated to the countryside, fires lit the skyline. Yet the capital endured. The sound of sirens and the smell of smoke became the rhythm of British life. Churchill wrote later, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." War expands. North Africa. While bombs fell on London, the war spread to the deserts. In North Africa, Italian forces attacked Egypt from Libya, seeking control of the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire. But their campaign faltered. By early 1941, German reinforcements arrived, the Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His tactics were swift, daring, and brutal. The sands became a chessboard of tanks and survival, battles fought in heat and mirage. The Balkans and Greece. Meanwhile, Mussolini, eager for glory, invaded Greece in October 1940, and failed spectacularly. Hitler, frustrated, had to intervene, diverting troops south. By April 1941, Yugoslavia and Greece had fallen under the Nazi flag. It delayed the next great offensive by weeks, a small delay, but one that would later change the fate of millions. Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941. Before dawn, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion in human history. Hitler called it a crusade against Bolshevism. He believed the Red Army would crumble in weeks. At first, it seemed he was right: entire Soviet divisions encircled, millions captured, cities falling in days. By autumn, German troops stood at the gates of Moscow. Yet the city did not fall. The winter came early. Machines froze. Fuel turned to gel. Men died where they stood. And still, the Soviets fought on. When the snows cleared, the myth of German invincibility was broken. The Pacific ignites, December 1941. Far across the world, another empire reached its breaking point. In the Pacific, Japan, starved of oil and raw materials, sought expansion. Its leaders saw the European war as opportunity. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, the American naval base in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or crippled. The United States, until then divided and hesitant, now entered the war. The following day, Roosevelt declared. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Germany and Italy declared war on America. In that moment, the conflict ceased to be European. It became a world war in truth. Epilogue: the world ablaze. By the end of 1941, the map had changed beyond recognition. Europe bowed under the swastika. Asia burned beneath the rising sun. Britain endured, battered but unbroken. And now America, the sleeping giant, had awakened. The war that began with the invasion of a single country had swallowed the planet. From the deserts of Africa to the snows of Russia, from the skies over London to the seas of the Pacific, humanity had entered its darkest hour. The years ahead would test not just armies, but the idea of civilization itself. The storm no longer moved across borders, it lived within every horizon. End of Part 2, Blitzkrieg and the Fall of Empires. Part 3, The Turning of the Tide, 1942 to 1943. By 1942, the war had consumed the world. More than 50 nations were now locked in conflict, from the icy steppes of Russia to the burning sands of North Africa, from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Pacific. Every sunrise revealed new borders drawn in blood. The Axis seemed unstoppable. Germany held Europe in chains. Japan ruled the Western Pacific. Italy clung to dreams of empire in Africa. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing, not in governments or generals, but in the rhythm of the war itself. The momentum, once a flood, began to slow. The year 1942 would prove that even empires can drown in their own victories. The Eastern Front, Stalingrad. It began with a name that would burn into history: Stalingrad. After the failure to seize Moscow, Hitler turned south. He wanted the oil of the Caucasus, the rivers that fed the Soviet heart, and the city that bore Stalin's name, as symbol, as trophy, as vengeance. In the summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army, 300,000 strong, marched east under the blazing sun. Behind them trailed dust, ghosts, and the illusion of destiny. By August, they reached the Volga. The city ahead was rubble already, its people refusing to leave. Then the battle began, not in fields or trenches, but in rooms, staircases, and cellars. Every house became a fortress. Every street changed hands 10 times. Soviet snipers hunted from shadows. German soldiers fought floor by floor, reduced to bayonets and grenades. The river itself ran red with fire. By November, the Germans held most of the city, but they had walked into a trap. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army struck from the north and south. In 4 days, they encircled 250,000 German troops. Hitler forbade retreat. He ordered them to fight to the last man. The air bridge he promised failed. Supplies dwindled. Frostbite and starvation did what the Soviets could not. By February 2, 1943, the last survivors surrendered. The invincible army of the Reich was gone. Germany had lost 500,000 men. And the world had gained something far greater, proof that the Nazi machine could break. North Africa, the desert turns. While Stalingrad froze, another battle burned under a different sun. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Corps pushed deep into Egypt. The desert was endless, the heat merciless, the lines of supplies stretched thin. Yet Rommel pressed on toward Alexandria, dreaming of the Suez Canal and the oil beyond. But a new name entered the desert, Bernard Montgomery. Calm, methodical, and relentless, he rebuilt the British Eighth Army with discipline and patience. Then, on October 23, 1942, under a moonlit sky, he struck El Alamein. It was the first major Allied victory against Germany. Rommel's tanks burned under the relentless bombardment. The desert echoed with the thunder of artillery, 900 guns firing in unison. By November, the Axis was in retreat, fleeing west across Libya. Churchill told Parliament, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. It was the beginning of the end for the Axis in Africa. The Pacific, Midway and the Silent Ocean. Half a world away, the sea itself was at war. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable, Singapore fell, the Philippines surrendered, and the rising sun stretched from Burma to New Guinea. But in June 1942, the tides shifted. At Midway Atoll, for Japanese aircraft carriers steamed east, planning to destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. But the Americans had cracked Japan's naval codes. They knew when, where, and how the attack would come. On June 4, 1942, waves of aircraft clashed over the Pacific. Within 5 minutes, the U.S. Navy destroyed 3 of Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. A 4th, Hiryu, fell by nightfall. The battle lasted 1 day, but it changed the war. Japan had lost its elite pilots, its momentum, and its myth of invincibility. For the first time, the empire was on defense. The Allied counterstroke, torch. After El Alamein, the Allies moved to strike from the west. On November 8, 1942, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, the first U.S. offensive of the war. It was a baptism by fire for American soldiers, many facing combat for the first time. French forces loyal to Vichy initially resisted but soon joined the Allies. By early 1943, Rommel's retreating army was trapped between British forces from Egypt and Americans from the west. The North African campaign ended in May 1943 with the surrender of 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. For the first time, Hitler's men were captured en masse outside Europe. The Mediterranean was now an Allied sea. The Atlantic War. While armies fought on land, the oceans remained deadly. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships by the hundreds. Britain starved for food and fuel. But technology turned the tide again, radar, sonar, and the cracking of German Enigma codes allowed Allied convoys to anticipate attacks. By late 1943, U-boat losses mounted so high that Admiral Donitz withdrew them. The Atlantic lifeline, once a graveyard, became a highway of supplies feeding Europe's liberation. Italy, the first Axis ally falls. With Africa secured, the Allies turned to Europe itself. Their next target, Italy, the soft underbelly of the Axis. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini's regime collapsed. He was arrested by his own king, Italy signed an armistice, and German troops rushed south to occupy the country. The war in Italy was long and bitter. At Monte Cassino, ancient monasteries became battlefields. Cities were bombed, civilians fled, and soldiers fought for every hill. But symbolically, the fall of Mussolini shattered the illusion of the Axis triumvirate. The dream of empire had become rubble. Resistance and occupation. Across occupied Europe, the underground stirred. In France, Yugoslavia, Poland, and the Netherlands, partisans attacked trains, destroyed bridges, and gathered intelligence for the Allies. They fought with little hope of survival, guided by the belief that tyranny could not last forever. In the shadows of Nazi occupation, another horror deepened, the Holocaust. By 1942, the final solution had become industrialized murder. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec operated with chilling efficiency. Millions of Jews, Roma, and political prisoners were transported in cattle cars to die unseen. The world had not yet grasped the scale of it. But the smoke over Poland told the truth that words could not. The turning year. By the end of 1943, the Axis powers were on the defensive everywhere. Germany had lost at Stalingrad, Africa, and in the Atlantic. Japan was retreating across the Pacific. And America's industrial might, factories roaring day and night, began to flood the world with planes, tanks, and ships. For the first time, the Allies began to plan victory. The question was no longer if the Axis would fall, but when, and at what cost. The tide had turned, slowly, painfully, irreversibly. The war that once devoured the world now began to consume its masters. End of Part 3, The Turning of the Tide, 1942 to 1943. Part 4, The Reckoning, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the war had reached its climax. For 5 years the world had burned, and now the flames began to turn back on those who had lit them. Germany still held most of Europe, but its borders trembled. Japan still commanded an empire, but its fleets lay shattered. The Axis, once triumphant, was now dying, slowly, violently, inevitably. The Allies had one goal left: invasion. The liberation of Europe would begin on the beaches of France. Operation Overlord, D-Day. For months, the Allies prepared in secret. Across the fields of southern England, soldiers trained endlessly. Engineers built floating harbors. Deception plans convinced the Germans the attack would come at Calais, not Normandy. On June 6, 1944, under grey skies and rough seas, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. More than 150,000 men crossed the English Channel. At dawn, Allied warships opened fire, shaking the coastline. The first waves of troops landed under machine gun fire that cut through the mist. At Omaha Beach, the sea turned red. But the line held. Inch by inch, they climbed the cliffs and broke through. By nightfall, 5 beachheads were secure. France, after 4 years of occupation, had begun to awaken. Eisenhower's message to his men that morning had been simple. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. They did. The liberation of France. The invasion poured forward. By July, the Allies had broken through the hedgerows of Normandy and advanced toward Paris. Resistance fighters rose up inside the city, striking German garrisons as Allied tanks closed in. On August 25, 1944, the French capital was free. Crowds filled the boulevards, tears and laughter mingling with the echoes of gunfire. General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées to the sound of church bells, bells that had been silent since 1940. Europe, for the first time in years, heard joy. The Eastern Front, the red tide. While the West stormed the beaches, the East became a flood. After Stalingrad and Kursk, the Soviet Union no longer fought for survival, it fought for revenge. In Operation Bagration, June 1944, the Red Army launched an assault so vast it erased the German Army Group Center. In 6 weeks, 28 divisions vanished. Cities like Minsk, Vilnius, and Warsaw fell one by one. But the price was unthinkable. Entire villages burned. Civilians caught between fronts were executed or starved. By the time Soviet forces reached the Vistula River, 2 million men had died in a single summer. To the east, the Germans left behind the ruins of their crimes, the death camps, the ghettos, the ashes. As Soviet soldiers entered Majdanek in July 1944, they discovered gas chambers and piles of human remains. For the first time, the world saw what the Holocaust truly meant. It was not rumor or propaganda. It was real, systematic, industrial, human darkness made mechanical. The Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, as winter returned, Hitler made one final gamble. In the Ardennes forest, the same route that had brought him victory in 1940, he launched his last great offensive. Under the cover of snow and fog, 200,000 German troops struck the Allied lines. American units were cut off, surrounded, and outnumbered. The front bent into a bulge on the map, but it did not break. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, U.S. paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held their ground despite being encircled. When the Germans demanded surrender, their commander, General McAuliffe, famously replied with a single word, nuts. By January 1945, the counterattack collapsed. Hitler's last hope of turning the tide had turned to ice. The collapse of the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the Allies advanced from both sides. From the west came the Americans, British, and Canadians. From the east came the Soviets, relentless and vengeful. Germany was a ruin, its cities flattened by relentless bombing. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, once vibrant centers of culture, now lay in ashes. The skies burned red at night from the glow of their own destruction. On April 16, 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. 2 million Soviet soldiers encircled the city. Every street became a battlefield. Civilians dug trenches with bare hands. Boys of 16 fought with rifles older than they were. In the Führerbunker beneath the Chancellery, Hitler refused to flee. He raved of betrayal, of secret weapons, of destiny. But destiny had already chosen. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. 2 days later, Berlin fell. On May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. After 6 years and more than 60 million deaths, the war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific. But half the world still burned. Japan, though reeling from defeat, refused to surrender. Its armies fought fanatically across islands whose names would become legend: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan. Each step closer to Japan cost tens of thousands of lives. Civilians leapt from cliffs rather than be captured. For the first time, America feared that the end of the war might require the destruction of an entire nation. Then, a new weapon emerged, one forged in secrecy, in the deserts of New Mexico, under the code name Manhattan Project. Its power was beyond imagination. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the American bomber Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single bomb, Little Boy. In a flash of white light, a city vanished. The explosion leveled everything within 2 kilometers. Tens of thousands died instantly, tens of thousands more burned in the days after. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, destroyed Nagasaki. Japan, stunned and broken, surrendered on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people for the first time, saying, "We must endure the unendurable." The war was over. The reckoning. When the guns finally fell silent, the world stood in ruins. Europe's cities were rubble, Asia's fields were graveyards, and humanity's conscience was scarred forever. The Holocaust had claimed 6 million Jewish lives. Entire nations had disappeared. Tens of millions were displaced, wandering among the ashes of civilization. In Nuremberg, the victors put the architects of terror on trial. For the first time, the phrase, "crimes against humanity," entered law. Men who once ruled continents now stood before judges, unable to look at the photographs of what they had done. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders faced similar reckoning. Empires that had lasted centuries were dismantled. Germany was divided. Japan occupied. The old order was gone. The new dawn. From ruin came rebirth. The United Nations was founded to prevent another catastrophe. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. But the peace was uneasy. Already the allies who had won together began to mistrust each other. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers, and a new shadow began to stretch across the world, the Cold War. Still, for one brief moment in 1945, as soldiers returned home and cities began to rebuild, humanity exhaled. The long night was over. The world had survived, but it would never be the same. The war ended, but the silence that followed was not peace, it was disbelief. End of Part 4, The Reckoning, 1944 to 1945. Part 5, The Memory of Fire, 1945, present. The guns fell silent. But silence did not mean peace. When the Second World War ended in August 1945, the world did not celebrate as one body healed, it shuddered like a wounded creature learning to walk again. More than 60 million lives were gone. Entire cities were erased. The map of humanity had been redrawn not by politics, but by ashes. What came next was not simply recovery. It was reinvention, a desperate, uneven attempt to rebuild civilization from the wreckage of its own cruelty. Europe in ruins. In the first months after victory, Europe was unrecognizable. Berlin was a skeleton of bricks. Warsaw was rubble. Vienna starved, Paris limped, and London's skyline was still blackened from the Blitz. Railways were twisted metal. Bridges gone. Rivers clogged with the wrecks of tanks. Millions wandered the continent, refugees, prisoners of war, survivors of camps, people without homes or names. Displaced persons camps filled with ghosts of nations that no longer existed. The phrase, "never again," was whispered among them, but even then, no one yet knew what "again" truly meant. The Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin itself, lying deep inside Soviet territory, was also split. At first, it seemed temporary. But soon the division hardened, the first fracture of a new age. The Nuremberg Trials. From November 1945 to October 1946, in a bombed-out German city, the victors assembled a court. 24 of the most powerful men of the Third Reich stood accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence filled entire rooms: films of the camps, ledgers of extermination, witnesses who spoke of gas and ash. When Hermann Göring, Hitler's deputy, was shown the footage of the camps, he turned away, pale. When prosecutors described the murder of 6 million Jews, silence fell heavy over the courtroom, a silence deeper than any denial. 12 were sentenced to death. Others to prison. But the real verdict was larger than their lives. For the first time in history, law reached higher than victory. Humanity itself had claimed jurisdiction over evil. The birth of the United Nations. Out of the ruins of the League of Nations rose a new hope. In October 1945, the United Nations was founded in San Francisco. Its charter spoke not of empire or revenge, but of peace, human rights, and collective security. It was idealistic and imperfect. The same powers that had fought shoulder to shoulder were already beginning to mistrust one another. The alliance that had defeated fascism was breaking apart, divided by ideology, by fear, by the question of who would shape the new world. The Iron Curtain. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Missouri. He warned that, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain lay Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all now under Soviet control. In the West, America and its allies feared that Stalin's Red Army, victorious and immense, would not stop at Berlin. The wartime unity between East and West turned into suspicion. Each side accused the other of seeking domination. By 1947, the world was divided not by front lines, but by ideologies: capitalism versus communism, freedom versus fear. A new conflict began, one colder, quieter, but perhaps even more dangerous. The Cold War. It began not with battlefields, but with weapons pointed into the void. The United States had the atomic bomb. By 1949, so did the Soviet Union. Soon both nations held the power to erase the world in minutes. This fragile balance of terror became the logic of survival. Each side built arsenals of unimaginable scale, thousands of nuclear warheads, missiles buried in silos, submarines that could destroy cities unseen. Wars still raged, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. But they were fought by proxy, shadows of the superpowers' rivalry. The fear was constant, invisible, and global. For the first time, humanity lived under the possibility of instantaneous extinction. Children learned to hide under desks. Leaders spoke of deterrence. Poets wrote of apocalypse. And the mushroom cloud became the new symbol of power. The division of Germany. Germany, once the heart of the war, became its clearest scar. In 1949, the Western zones united into the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, while the East became the German Democratic Republic under Soviet influence. Berlin, though entirely within East Germany, was split by occupation sectors, until, in 1961, the Berlin Wall rose overnight. Concrete and barbed wire divided families, friends, and streets. East German guards shot those who tried to escape westward. For 28 years, the wall stood as the physical embodiment of the Cold War, a frontier not between armies, but between ideas. When it finally fell in 1989, the sound of hammers breaking concrete echoed like liberation itself. The Middle East and the birth of Israel. The war's end reshaped not only Europe, but the Middle East. The horrors of the Holocaust spurred international support for a Jewish homeland. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Within hours, it was attacked by neighboring Arab nations. The conflict that followed, between Israelis and Palestinians, became one of the most enduring legacies of the Second World War's displacement. Empires had fallen, but their borders still burned. Asia and the end of empires. Japan, after its surrender, was occupied by the United States. Under General MacArthur, it transformed from a militarist empire into a democracy. Its economy, rebuilt with American aid, became one of the strongest in the world within a generation. By the 1960s, Japanese cities glowed again, not with fire, but with neon. Elsewhere in Asia, colonial powers crumbled. India, long under British rule, gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan. Across Africa and Southeast Asia, nations rose from the ruins of empire, sometimes peacefully, often in blood. The war had not just redrawn borders, it had ended the very idea that empire could last forever. Europe's reconstruction, the Marshall Plan. In the West, America launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic aid that poured billions into rebuilding European industry, infrastructure, and confidence. Factories reopened. Currency stabilized. France and Germany, once sworn enemies, began cooperation that would one day become the European Union. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union built its own sphere, forcing allegiance through the Warsaw Pact. Two Europes now faced each other, one built on prosperity and alliance, the other on ideology and control. The age of fear and hope. Through the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War defined everything: art, science, politics, even the stars. The competition extended into the heavens as the space race began. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. In 1969, the United States answered with Apollo 11, and the first human footprints on the moon. Yet even in triumph, the shadow of war remained. Every scientific breakthrough was haunted by its military twin. The same rockets that carried astronauts could also carry warheads. But the human spirit proved more stubborn than fear. Movements for peace, civil rights, and disarmament grew louder. The same generation raised in the shadow of the bomb began to demand a world that could live without it. The fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling under its own weight: stagnant economy, political repression, and endless competition with the West. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, reform, tried to save it, and instead unraveled it. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War ended without a final shot. For the first time in half a century, the world exhaled. But peace did not mean unity. Old rivalries flared in new forms: ethnic wars in the Balkans, terrorism, and new authoritarian regimes rising from the ashes of old ideologies. The memory of fire. 80 years after the first tanks crossed into Poland, the memory of the Second World War still shapes every border, every alliance, every silence. NATO still guards Europe. The United Nations still debates war and peace under the same blue flag born from the ashes of 1945. The bomb still exists, thousands of them, their existence a quiet reminder of the lessons humanity promised never to forget. The survivors of that war grow fewer each year, their stories fading into history books. But their shadows remain. Every time a siren sounds, a border shifts, or a city burns, the echo of that war can still be heard. The world that emerged from 1945 is the one we live in still, bound by the same contradictions, progress and peril, unity and division, compassion and cruelty. We built cities higher, machines faster, networks wider, but beneath it all, the same question remains. Can we learn from what we survived? Epilogue: The Fire Within. From the rubble of Berlin to the neon of Tokyo, from the camps of Poland to the satellites above Earth, the story of the Second World War is not simply one of death. It is a story of transformation. The war proved that humanity could destroy itself, and then, somehow, decide not to. That we could use the same hands to build hospitals, launch rockets, and hold each other again. History does not repeat itself, it remembers. And as long as that memory burns, even faintly, we still have a chance to be worthy of survival. We rebuilt the world not because we deserved to, but because we had to. End of Part 5, The Memory of Fire, 1945, present. Epilogue of The Second World War. A story of the human century.